Question for you. What is the first thing you would do if you and your buddy were arguing over who the best program in history is? Of course, you jump on Google and see who has the most national championships. And of course it's Alabama. USC? Notre Dame? Well, if you go by the total count of national titles voted for and those that have been claimed by schools, Princeton actually leads all schools with a whopping 28 claimed national titles. But this video isn't about them. In today's video, I want to focus on the team with the second most claimed national titles, Yale. Now let's go back to that graphic. It may surprise some of you to see that there are 3 Ivy League schools in the top 10 of most claimed natties. But historically speaking, it really shouldn't. Ivy League schools pretty much invented the game, with Princeton and Rutgers playing in the first game and dominated in the sport's infancy, even though no Ivy League school has won a national championship since 1950 when Kentucky did it. Psych! It was actually Princeton. As a side note, Princeton and Rutgers share the 1869 national championship, with each team finishing 1-1 in a season where they played the only 2 games. Another interesting fact is that Yale is the first team to win at least 10 games and be crowned national champion. This happened with their 13-0 1888 squad, which is also the first national champion to be credited with having a coach. That coach was Walter Camp. And let me just tell you right now, I cannot divulge everything about Walter Camp right now because the man is getting his own video. So be on the lookout for that one, because holy cow, is it going to just implode your brain. But let's go ahead and back up to the formation of the Yale Bulldog football team. The year was 1872, and joining Columbia, Rutgers, and Princeton for the new game of football were 2 more teams, Yale and Stevens Tech. There were 5 games played that season, with Columbia playing in the most and finishing with a record of 1-2-1. Returning champion Princeton would win their only game and take home a share of the championship for the 1872 season. The other team was upstart Yale. Now, how wild is it to think that a team in their very first season went undefeated and was crowned the national champion? Of course, they too finished 1-0, having beaten Columbia 3-0. And this was a newly devised, underdeveloped game with rules that changed every game, sometimes the rules being agreed upon just before the game was even played. But it's still a crazy piece of trivia. And this would start the string of 16 seasons in which the Bulldogs would not have to wait more than 2 years between national championships. They were Alabama before Alabama, the original dynasty. Only 2 seasons later and the Bulldogs were back at it, winning the second of their 26 titles in the first 38 years of college football's existence. Let's skip to the first really interesting Yale team though, that being their 1883 squad. This season they outscored their opponents 540-2, with bitter rival Harvard scoring the only 2 points in the last game of the season. Now 1883 was the first year that touchdowns, even though they weren't known by this name then, were awarded more than a single point. They increased to 4 points, meaning they scored the equivalent of 135 touchdowns without giving up a single one defensively in 9 games. Now the Dogs had multiple seasons where they were unscored upon up to this point, but this was by far the most prolific season in terms of offensive scoring. Also, I couldn't discuss this team without mentioning that they beat Wesleyan 90-0 and Columbia 93-0 that year. Just simply incredible. Over the next 14 years, they would outscore opponents 6,337 points to 213 and collect shares of 10 national championships, 5 consecutively from 1891 to 1895. They would also rack up a 161 5 losses, 6 tie record during this time. And one of the most famous plays in early football happened in the Princeton-Yale game of 1885. The Bulldogs held a 5-0 lead in the highly anticipated rematch of the prior year's championship, which was actually declared a no contest after it was shortened due to darkness. That's just wild to think about. This game was also the first to be held on campus instead of a neutral site, and thus it brought a lot of buzz around town. Now, Henry Lamar was one of the Tigers that dropped back to receive a Yale punt and actually caught the kick after it deflected off of a teammate's shoulder. He took the ball in stride and headed up the sideline. But once he was cornered, he changed direction, ducked under the arms of 2 defenders, and continued his return up the middle of the field and scored, giving Princeton the win and the national championship. This play is credited with bringing a growing popularity to the sport. So, not a good memory for Yale, but one that definitely needs to be remembered by all fans. That would have definitely been the SportsCenter top play, and it would get played alongside highlights of Devin Hester, Johnny Manziel, and Lamar Jackson if it happened today. 1891 saw the Bulldogs go a perfect 13-0 and go unscored upon while scoring 488 points themselves on their way to yet another national championship. Is this the greatest team to ever play? Well, because they're the topic of this video, I'm going to say yes. The 1891 Yale Bulldogs are the greatest team to ever play. Walter Camp left after the 1892 season to coach Stanford for their 1892 season. What? Well, we'll get into that in the Walter Camp video. It's an intriguing story. In 1893, the game between Yale and Harvard on Thanksgiving Day was attributed by the New York Herald as ruining the holiday, as, quote, "Thanksgiving Day is no longer a solemn festival to God for mercies given. It's a holiday granted by the state and nation to see a game of football." Must have been a Harvard man. Even though they didn't keep any long-tenured coaches, the success continued on the gridiron for the Bulldogs, and they would not suffer their first losing season until 1915, a whole 43 years after their inception, when Frank Hinkey went 4-5. They would claim one more national title, their last, when legendary coach Tad Jones's 1927 squad went 7-1 with their lone loss at 10-14 defeat to Georgia, who also claimed a title that year. Before the 1956 season, the Ancient Eight, as they were known, were broken off into their own league, the Ivy League. They won the first Ivy League championship in the 1956 season and another in 1960. Yale had given way to the emerging Princeton and Harvard teams of the mid-60s, and John Pont left after posting a 12-5-1 record over 2 seasons. Carmen Coates' tenure got off to a rocky start, posting back-to-back losing seasons for the first time since the 30s. Coates had turned things around in 1967 by going 8-1 and winning his first conference title. Turns out Coates was a decent hire. He would go on to win 9 more Ivy League championships. He would only suffer 9 losing seasons in 32 years, and most of those came with his later years with the program. I would consider Coates the second greatest coach in school history, just behind Camp. Coates was the longest tenured coach in school history and won 179 games, but Camp had those unscored upon teams and is credited with so many inventions for the game itself, so that's why I'll list him number 1. They have won 16 league championships and have recently seen a resurgence under current head coach Tony Reno, most recently 2017 and 2019. Alright, it's story time. I wanted to touch on some of the incredible characters that I ran into while I was researching for this video. First up, and tying back to my last video, is Amos Alonzo Stagg. Stagg was the first paid college coach, and he actually got his start in an unusual place. Stagg's first head coaching job came at the YMCA. I can confidently say that he will be the only person in history to have been the head coach of the YMCA football program and go on to win national championships and be inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame. Now, Stagg was a vegetarian, and he actually held his 1907 team at Chicago to the same diet. They went 4-1 and won a conference title that year. The Stagg Bowl is the Division III national championship game. I like that this isn't just another generic bowl game sponsored by some unknown corporation. I definitely appreciate that they're actually paying homage to the history of the game instead of bringing us the D3 National Championship presented by Pabst Blue Ribbon. And Stagg's longest lasting influences on the college football are his numerous innovations, and just to list a few: the end around and reverse plays. He shares credit for inventing the center snapping the ball, along with John Heisman and Walter Camp. He's credited with inventing the onside kick, the huddle, the Statue of Liberty play, uniform numbers, varsity letters, the T formation, and he contributed to the invention of the forward pass, actually. He's also the father of bringing a man in motion and the freaking linebacker position. The entire position itself. You could argue that someone would have come up with these innovations eventually, but the fact that one man contributed all of these things to the game is just outstanding, and every one of these inventions is still used to this very day, from Little League all the way through the pros. Next we have Pudge Heffelfinger. What a name. Remember how Jay Burwanger was the first player drafted in the NFL draft? If so, you probably remember that he never played a down in the pros due to an inability to come to an agreement on his pay. He was wanting $1,000 a game. Well, another first for professional players is the first professional player. That honor belongs to Yale's Pudge Heffelfinger. Old Pudge was a guard for Walter Camp back in the late 90s. The 1890s. There we go. He had planned on attending the University of Minnesota, but in his senior year of high school, he's persuaded by Yale alumni to come play for the Bulldogs, and he was even tutored to ensure that he passed the entrance exam. Do you think the NCAA would consider that an impermissible benefit? Could you imagine the ridicule if an Ivy League school was handed recruiting violations because it tutored its recruit to ensure they'd even make it into the school? It was said that he walked with his head to the ground and kind of dejected looking, apparently unknowing at the fear he struck in his opponents. All 6'3", 210 pounds of them. People tried many ways to get Heffelfinger to realize the potential player he could unlock if he gained some confidence. Well, one day they found the perfect way. A graduate coach decided to procure some blood from a local slaughterhouse and proceeded to use said blood to write on the wall. It's been reported to have been the strongest worded letter. That's right, an entire letter, not just his name and blood on the wall, an entire letter, using every term the coach could think of. Well, our boy Pudge must have been scared shitless. But it worked, because he turned it on and would end up a 3-time All-American for the Bulldogs. Hef also lettered in baseball, rowing, and track at Yale. Oh yeah, and he was the university's heavyweight boxing champion. Turns out there was a real badass behind that unassuming demeanor. He was heavily recruited to play for professional clubs and was eventually offered $500, that's $14,000 2019 dollars, to help the Allegheny Athletic Association, and when he accepted that wage, he became the first reported paid player of American football. Our last subject I've nicknamed Mr. International. Born in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1870, Lee McClung grew up to be a smart young man. You know how I know he was smart? Because he would attend Yale in 1888. That's it. That's all the proof I need. While there, he decided to exercise both his brain and his body by joining Walter Camp's football program. While playing for 4 seasons, his teams would compile a 54-2 record and outscored their opponents 2,269 to 49. He was also considered the most popular football player in the country during his Bulldog career. He's thought to have invented the cutback play and was responsible for 494 points during his career. He was a class leader, was voted the most popular in his senior year, and was a member of the Skull and Bones Society. After graduation, McClung traveled throughout Europe and California, where he would become the second head coach at the University of California. After that, he moved on from coaching and joined the St. Paul and Duluth Railroad Company, and then the Southern Railroad Company. While at Southern, he worked his way up to the assistant to the vice president and eventually assistant freight traffic manager. In 1904, his alma mater appointed him treasurer of the university. It was during this time that he got in a bit of trouble for satirically writing about the sale of the then defunct Ingham University, which was the first chartered women's university in the U.S. In his writing, he called it, quote, a defunct college that we should be very pleased to sell on very low terms to anyone making due application. If it may prove an incentive to the consummation of the deal, I should be very much pleased to throw in a cemetery which is located on the grounds. Now, I understand why that's offensive to some, but that's pretty funny. His next stop was Washington, as he was appointed Treasurer of the United States by William Howard Taft. He handed his predecessor a check for exactly $1,260,134,946.88 2/3, the amount of monies and securities in the department the day McClung took office. It took them over 2 months to count all of it and was said to be the largest financial transaction from man to man in world history at the time. While he was in office, he urged that dirty, worn money be withdrawn at a higher rate in order to establish a more sanitary currency. Some political drama forced McClung out of office, and on the day he left, he handed his successor a check for $1,519,285,908.57 2/3, and just the day before had declared in a speech that, quote, it is physically possible to steal $100 million from the Treasury of the United States. I don't know if I would admit that out loud. Later career movements for our boy Bum included being a director for the Phoenix Mutual Life Insurance Company, a director of the Marion Institute of Alabama, a national councilman for the Boy Scouts of America, and treasurer of the American Association for Highway Improvement. Mr. International died in a private hospital in London 3 months after contracting typhoid fever in Frankfurt. His body was shipped back to the States, and 9 days later, his funeral was held at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in New York. Following the service, his body took its last trip back home to Knoxville, where it was buried in the Old Gray Cemetery, but not before spending 2 more days at his sister's home for additional services. What a bunch of badass, manly men characters, and these are only some of them. Imagine all the stories that are floating around out there, or some even completely lost to time, of the beginnings of football and an evolution of a country and a world. That's part of why I'm embarking on this series, to reminisce about my formation as a person and as a college football fan, because I feel that they're more inextricably linked than not, and to share stories, whether they be ones you're familiar with or stories you've never even dreamed could exist. So in closing, I just want to point out that Yale is a program that only has 30 losing seasons and almost 150 years of existence. Clemson has 35 and 24 fewer seasons. And just let that sink in. Looking back on my last video about Chicago, this is a much happier story for one of the originators of the game. And I'm looking forward to see if the 2021 season will proceed as normal for the Ivy League, and if it does, I will definitely be paying closer attention to the Yale Bulldogs, and I suggest you do too.